Okay, Tom. So today we're going to talk about wills versus trusts and do we need one or the other in Florida and how to decide which we need. So if someone in Florida, particularly Central Florida, the Orlando area, asks if I need a will or a trust, what's the first thing that you want them to understand about making that decision?
Well, I think it's unfortunately it's a multi-layer question. It's not a one yes or no on anything. I think one thing you need to look at is your incapacity plan. Do you have a fiduciary that you trust? Obviously, if you don't have a family member that can act as a successor trustee or a power of attorney for you, typically you need an individual to act as a power of attorney, and as such, you may need a trust plan to get a corporate trustee involved, like Bank of America or Sun or Truist or Seaside Bank or whoever you choose, PNC, all the different trust companies that may be able to step in to assist with your finances during incapacity if you don't have an individual to act as a power of attorney. Another thing to look at is the beneficiary structure. How complex is your beneficiary structure? Is it when I die, I want everything going outright to my son Joey and that's done? Or does it have to go into a trust fund for Joey? Is there creditor issues? So we look at the complexity of the beneficiary structures. Excuse me, three, we look at the type of assets. Some assets allow beneficiary designations to avoid probate. Some do not. And as such, we may need to utilize a trust to avoid probate if you do not want to go through probate courts. Another thing is the complexity of your administration. Do you have a lot of creditors? Do you have many businesses? Do you have a lot of tax disputes? Do you have multiple beneficiaries? The complexity of the administration can and sometimes not lend itself to beneficiary designations. And if you want to avoid probate, you may need a trust. And also is look at the location of the beneficiaries. Are your beneficiaries local? Are they in Alaska? Are they in Europe? Are they somewhere else where it's not easy to go to the bank and cash out accounts? So there's a lot of different things that we look at to decide whether we want a will or a trust or a beneficiary designation. And it's really specific client guided.
You mentioned how a will interacts with probate there. How does a trust interact with probate?
A trust should not have to interact with probate. The purpose, one of the main goals of a trust is to have assets in a trust's name during your lifetime.
Okay.
So I actively set up a trust during my lifetime and I transfer ownership from Tom Moss to the Tom Moss Trust. And as such, when I die, there's not an asset in my name, it's in the trust name that would allow my successor trustee to immediately step in and control that asset. Anytime you have a trust, typically we have also something called a pour over will, which is a little confusing for my clients. The reason you still have a will is sometimes people aren't perfect. Even though we tell them to put assets into the trust, they may have forgot about a bank account. And the purpose of the pour over will is we'd have a small probate for that one asset and it pours over into the trust. So it cleans everything up nicely. However, in a perfect world, we would not have a probate if we have a trust.
What are some of the biggest myths that you hear about wills? Like things that people assume a simple will can do, but they actually can't.
Yeah. I think the biggest myth is that you don't have to have court oversight and you don't have to have an attorney involved. They think that, hey, if the will's clear, it says it goes to Joey when I die. Why do I need to go to a judge to decide that? And that's really what a will is. It's saying, hey, go to a probate court and administer my estate. So I think the biggest misconception with a will is they think that you only go to probate if you don't have a will, but if a will avoids probate, no, a will is probate. It's testate probate. So I think that's the biggest misconception.
Okay. And on the other side, what about trusts? Like, only rich people need trusts or trust solves everything. What are some of those
Well,
misconceptions people have?
again, I think that everyone, I think a trust is something that's marketed by a lot of people.
Mhm.
And I think it's sometimes oversold. For example, if I have a client that comes to me that has, a very simple structure, they're a widow, they have one son who's fully able, fully capable. She's elderly. She has an IRA and a house. Well, at this point, we can just do a beneficiary designation on the IRA. and do a ladybird deed on the house and avoid probate, and it's clean and easy and nice and done. So again, depending on the client and their intent and their beneficiaries and their assets, sometimes trusts are overused. If I have if all I have is an IRA, there's no reason for a trust. I can't even put an IRA by rule into the trust during my lifetime.
Hmm.
So if it's solely to avoid probate, you can avoid probate with an IRA with a beneficiary designation. So again, the type of assets and what your goals really dictate whether a trust is necessary. And, I tell people I use trust every day in my practice, but at the same time, I'm not going to oversell a trust for no reason.
When you're helping someone decide one or the other, what are the main factors you're looking at for deciding on a will versus a trust, or those elements like family, assets, goals, etc.?
Sure. So the first thing I look at is, do they have a individual, a person that they trust that can act as a fiduciary with regards to their property? If they don't have a person they can trust, then we're going to have to look at a corporate trustee. So a power of attorney doesn't necessarily do everything we need to do for them. So that may be a reason why if you're just a widowed lady with no adult children that has no family members here, and or your family members are all problems, you may need to have a corporate trustee. So that may lead us towards a trust versus just using a power of attorney. The second thing I look at is your beneficiary structure. Do you have, what's your goals? If you died, do you want all your assets just going outright to your family members? Or do you want it going into a special needs trust if you have a disabled child, or a marital trust if you're in a second marriage, or if your child has a creditor issue and you're doing some type of creditor protection planning trusts? So again, what's your beneficiary structure? Is it okay that it just goes outright? And that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that sometimes, but you have to kind of look at that. Next is the type of assets. If you have certain assets that don't lend themselves to beneficiary designation, so you'd have to go through probate. At that point, we may want to transfer assets into a trust. Then you look at the complexity of the administration. Do you have 13 businesses and 17 properties and,
Mhm.
multi years of tax returns and multi business tax returns to do? And, if the more complex it is, the more you may lend itself to a trust versus an outright beneficiary designation. Another thing to think about too is the problem with beneficiary designations as well is it doesn't leave any money in the estate to administer
Mm.
the last final fees and taxes. So I'll pick on my brother Ken and I. If my mom puts my brother Ken and I as a beneficiary designation on a $1 million bank account, and that's all she has, who files her final tax returns? What if there's a $75,000 final tax return due? And I call my brother up and say, hey, give me half that money back that was on that beneficiary designation. And he says no. Well, then you're setting up disputes. Now, in my case, I'm confident that my brother would give me that half back. So in our family, that would probably work. But depending on the relationship of your children sometimes and the beneficiaries that directly inherit the money, that can create problem with finalizing your final taxes and so forth.